you to Augustus Wood for being here, and for our attendees for tuning in. We are kind of near the end of our series on the state of democracy. We have 2 more talks after this, so I would encourage y'all to follow our Facebook page and keep updated on those. So it's been a really, really wonderful series. I think we've heard from a lot of wonderful folks and a lot of important perspectives. And so during this election year, we kind of just wanted to zoom out and think about broader issues and how people have been participating both in and outside of the polls. And so big shout out to our sponsors for making this series possible. Casey just sent the list in our chat. We're super grateful. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce Augustus. Second. So Augustus Wood is a scholar of political economy and gentrification, social movements, and working class labor in the late 20th and early 21st century African-American urban history. He is currently a postdoc research associate in labor and education program at the University of Illinois. Dr. Wood has authored articles that appeared in the Labor Studies Journal and co-authored book chapters with Dr. Sundiata Chaja. I always kind of butcher that. He is the editor of the upcoming special edition of Labor Studies Journal on Black workers and COVID. He is a contributor on Routledge's forthcoming Encyclopedia of Anti-Racism. He is also a member of the editorial board of the Humanities and Social Sciences Journal. He hosts the Radio Free Labor program on 90.1 FM WEFT Champaign Radio, and the podcast Off the Shelf, Revolutionary Readings in the Time of Crises. Where can people find your podcast?
Well, we're going to be posting the Off the Shelf Revolutionary Readings podcast on the Humanities Research Institute website on the university page, since it is sponsored by the Humanities Research Institute. So that'll be there, and we'll probably post in other places as well. But yeah.
Sweet. That's awesome. HRI is my other employer, so big shout out to them. So yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here. We're really grateful.
I thank you for having me. Thank you for this amazing series. You know, it's one of the most powerful aspects about what the university does in terms of the university YMCA and just the awesome work that, you know, we have a very detailed relationship going back 7-8 years with the Y, particularly when I was working with the Graduate Employees Organization, the local 6300, which is one of my favorite organizations in the world. Shout out to y'all. And so yeah, I told Michelle, anytime that I can be helping or do anything for the Y, then that's automatic, especially with a topic this important. So I'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover. The title is interesting for those, especially for those of you who are not from the South or who are not familiar with the Boll Weevil. I come from a sharecropping family, and so there were always stories passed around about the Boll Weevil. And in doing the research for my book that I'm working on, you know, there was a really great story that one of the sanitation workers in Atlanta would always talk about, a gentleman named Finley Holmes. He said, quote, "My daddy told me a story about the Boll Weevil. You know, the Boll Weevil used to keep the poor man down by eating the cotton crop. Then they came up with this spray that'll kill him. Now all the Boll Weevils moved to the city and put on coats, ties, and badges," end quote. And so this quote points far beyond the simple destruction of Black bodies, but also the meticulous planning and the use of the amalgamation of police, public officials, and businesses to reduce the capacity of African Americans to hold any power in determining our lives. So the Boll Weevil's destruction of the cotton crop, the very item responsible for the social conditions of rural Black sharecroppers, completely decimated the viability of Black families to build any wealth or possess control over their lives in the US at any time. So today, a different threat in a more passable process continues to repress Black working class people across the nation. And so the purpose of this talk is to expand our understanding of the police state through the internal neo-colonialism framework, which I argue is the most appropriate context for analyzing the African-American experience. The problem we face today under the current crisis of racial oppression is the tendency to compartmentalize police and their threat as simple brutality or explicit violence on Black bodies, or the mass incarceration system as this isolated structure onto itself. While both of these are critical to racial oppression, yes, they operate as specific functions of a much larger process undergirded by the tripartite apparatuses of racial oppression: political subjugation, economic exploitation, and social humiliation. The misconception of the police as an individual, isolated entity solely responsible for individual acts of violence against poor people, predominantly African Americans, feeds the limitations of defunding the police protests and subsequent inaction on behalf of the local governments and community development corporations to listen to those protests. And it also distracts us from a more complex take on the power of the police and how it operates with other institutions in racial oppression. Thus, to fight racial oppression, the objective must be to depower the police state. But that is only feasible if we fully understand their true role in reducing African-American capacity to live and organize for more control over our lives. Gentrification becomes one of the major elements today that falls into this category. The redevelopment in urban spaces has generally been defined in both popular and scholarly arenas as singular, organic consequences of progress and urbanization. And presented in this manner, gentrification appears as a top-down and one-sided process controlled solely through real estate interests. However, through a partnership between public and private pro-growth interests, gentrification serves as a form of structural violence against urban poor, specifically African Americans, where our bodies and spaces are viewed as superfluous and expendable commodities for market interests. In fact, the neoliberalization and subsequent gentrification of cities, such as Atlanta, serve as the new stages of the internal neo-colonial model. The planned destruction, removal, reconstitution, and surveillance of a significant portion of a specifically defined group of colonized subjects. When a dominant group purposely deprives both the material and non-material sources from a subordinated group in an effort to reduce their capacity to build institutions and improve the quality of their living and social spaces, those policies, indirect in nature, must be considered violent. The neo-colonial model is crucial for this indirect violence. As scholar activist Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral posited, instead of traditional colonialism, where there's a dominant white ruling class serving as the direct overseers in proximity with their colonial subjects, neo-colonialism requires members of the subordinated group to act as indirect rulers or as a petty bourgeoisie or an administrative class whose sole purpose is to facilitate exploitation through a new form of racial oppression. Because this new class of indirect rulers generally must repress challenges to its power, it often expands its military and police power against the subordinated working classes. The police serve as indirect agents of violence during gentrification because they assist in the insight, the restriction, or the expropriation of vital political, economic, and social resources that subvert the capacity for oppressed groups to sustain social movements. As a result of the gentrification process, colonized African Americans under assault from indirect violence are politically, socially, and economically marginalized in ways that simultaneously deny them physical, psychological, and emotional well-being and heighten their exposure to social problems. Structural violence not only erases the individuality and racial class struggles by being less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals, but is no less destructive of human life. Its long-term meticulousness and the manipulation of its advocacy via progressive discourse and publicity provides the overall operation with established and respected forces in society, and thus does not receive the same condemnation that direct and explicit violence against Blacks receive. The level of outrage that explicit police killings of Blacks far outweighs the outrage heard about hundreds of thousands of African Americans displaced, starving to death, becoming housing insecure, and dying as a result of urban reorganization and gentrification, because the latter is seen as a rational, unfortunate consequence of pro-growth liberalism. And the COVID crisis is a perfect example of this problem being exacerbated to its highest level at this moment, what we call a new nadir in the African-American socio-historical experience, at our lowest point in terms of where we are currently in the political economy. At its core, gentrification provides the white ruling class with a contemporary, structural, and a more acceptable form of anti-Black racism. The 20th century civil rights and the human rights movements and the technologically dominant age with its abundance of television, computers, cell phone screens has phased out direct mass racial violence as a tactic of racial oppression. Now, you do have individual shootings here or there, but the actual cleansing of a space that was done in 1920s in Tulsa, in 1921 Tulsa, in 1919 Chicago, East St. Louis 1917, mass cleansings are no longer considered rational because of these new advances. As a result, political, economic, and social marginalization undergird a secondary, more palatable mechanism for exploiting and, when necessary, removing superfluous Black bodies and spaces. Through a combination of pro-growth ideology, liberal discourses on freedom and crime prevention, and race leaders, the white ruling class replaced explicit mass anti-Black racial violence while still wielding state-sponsored and private racial violence as a tool, as we've seen with George Floyd and other, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, with a more clandestine, structural form of cleansing. And through neoliberalization, Black urban regimes or Black-controlled city councils, school boards, or other municipal power in the metro regions transfer Black public resources like neighborhoods, federally subsidized public housing projects, public schools, livable wage blue-collar labor spaces like factories and recreation centers, all of it transferred to land developers and global private capital. Real estate teamed with the police and pro-growth officials and the Chamber of Commerce to manipulate urban land rents and property values, while public officials often refuse to collect millions of dollars in taxes from the upper middle and upper class homeowners and businesses. This simultaneously hurled the city of Atlanta into crippling debt and provided justification for city officials to implement regressive taxing and cut public services, further alienating the Black working classes, because the officials can always go to the media and say, there's nothing but crime there anyway. Look at the police surveillance there. They must be in crime. They don't need the resources anymore. We need to put them somewhere else and redevelop our city for progress. The police served as the crucial occupying force for neoliberalization and gentrification in these struggles in Atlanta. According to former police chief Herbert Jenkins, who served in the position from 1947 to 1972, the department was a breeding and training ground for Ku Klux Klan members, and those officers who refused membership in the Klan were demoted or bullied out of the department. Jenkins, who himself joined the Klan in 1933 when he first joined the police force, stated that, quote, the Klan was powerful and that it worked behind the scenes with certain members of the police committee and the city council, end quote. Thus, this demonstrates how the police operate as a systemic tool for the internal colonialism of Blacks, how white supremacy influenced its internal policies as well as its political machinations in the city, regardless of the color of the leadership. That must be made clear. After taking power as the first Black mayor in Atlanta in 1973, Maynard Jackson kept his campaign promises of strict law and order by expanding police funding, surveillance, weaponry, and powers through federal state grants and scrounging local tax revenues, at the same time courting and recruiting international business investment in those Black spaces, because they were already thinking 10, 15, 20 years ahead for how gentrification would look. They were planning it in the early 1970s as a response to the upsurge of Black power organizing, human rights, social movements on the ground for material changes for African-American working class lives, etc. It's no mistake that between 1970 and 1973, Atlanta was known as Strike Fever City, because so many Black striking workers went out and to fight for control over decision-making in their labor, and also community control of institutions in the city. So what's interesting about this is that when Jackson responds to this resistance, he did this by pathologizing Black working class Atlanta as predisposed to violent crime and propagandizing areas with high concentrations of Black workers in the city as dangerous, unsafe, and backwards. Although bourgeois and petty bourgeois media, academia, and other forms of cultural production incorrectly pathologize African Americans as predisposed toward crime, I argue that the political economy of crime is an inherent social condition to capitalist exploitation. Many individuals that sit at the top of illegal empires are non-Black, but like vampires, they accrue surplus profits off the exploitation of a disproportionate number of Black working class people subjugated by the racist labor market and seeking any form of income, that end up joining what Karl Marx called the lumpen proletariat, or the underground economy. Concurrently, when you pathologize crime along racial lines, it serves the bourgeois and petty bourgeois classes in four strategic ways. It justifies apartheid and restricting control and access to public and private resources. It fractures ethnic groups over ideological and class lines. It criminalizes the poor, thus reshaping racial formations and public perception. And it devalues or blights the land and property values in these neighborhoods. In other words, what Jackson and the Black urban regime there, and when I say Black urban regime, I'm talking about a municipal power that is dominated by Black people, whether it be school board, city council, whatever it be. That's a Black urban regime. Utilized his war on crime, or what he called his war on crime, to destabilize and criminalize the active low-income Black residents. Thus, they concentrated the underground economy, which we call the drug trade, the territorial conflict over profits, and the Black market for stolen goods, away from high business spaces, and they concentrate it into the poorest sections of the city, and they allow it to operate freely. Those who are familiar with the show The Wire in season 3, in the arc of Amsterdam. That is literally what happens in urban spaces, is that police in line with the Chamber of Commerce's and other business people, they will concentrate what they call criminal element, the underground economy, into an area and allow it to run free. That is what's happening in Chicago. That's what happens in Atlanta, etc. As long as it doesn't violate or interfere in the surplus profits or the accumulation of capital, and it is against this group of people that have been deemed to be undesirable, African-American poor people, then it will be allowed to continue. And that is the only reason why it occurs in that manner. This is part of the neoliberalization process. It is not separate from that. With these new powers that the Atlanta Police Department, that Jackson gave the Atlanta Police Department, they began targeting Black working class neighborhood leaders and radical organizations for suppression and assassination. Because you see, the one thing that the working class neighborhood leaders during Black Power were doing is they were calling out this contradiction that, wait a minute, you got all these police officers coming here and yet you're allowing drugs to actually run rampant in our neighborhoods. Well, we're going to call you out, and we're also going to fight against what you're doing to our neighborhoods. And so the police start targeting those leaders and labor leaders as well. During the height of Black Power, the power structure equated working class social movement run-ins with the police as criminal behavior and potentially damaging to future investment interests. In August 1973, Atlanta's Black and white elites sponsored research from the Metropolitan Atlanta Commission on Crime and Juvenile Delinquency. That was one of the most ultra right-wing organizations in the US at the time, headed by Atlanta market and private security force owner Dillard Munford and African-American insurance giant and future president of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, Jesse Hill Jr. Other affluent African-American members of this group are a who's who of people today in Atlanta are celebrated for being these progressive Black business owners. Herman J. Russell, educator Horace Ward, and businessman Lyndon Wade. Again, these are so-called progressive business leaders who were celebrated today, but they were members of an ultra-right organization that sought out to propagandize poor Black areas as being dangerous and criminally overrun simply to get their land and to build upon it. Now we have to understand how all these forces operate together. The commission argued that Atlanta must construct a campaign to eliminate, quote, undesirable business locations, end quote, citing that the 10th Street area was a, quote, and for those that are familiar with Atlanta, that's over by Georgia Tech today, quote, a gathering point for disorderly elements, end quote. That's what they said. So in other words, they equated crime with a significant Black residential corridor. And the commission recommended, quote, thorough investigation and use of undercover operations to collect information to justify closing places that constitute a public nuisance by canceling their business licenses, end quote. And so the commission concluded by urging, quote, residents and operators and businesses located in the vicinity of these undesirable locations report to the police the nature of the activities which occur, making them unattractive to the general public, but a gathering point for hoodlum elements, end quote. So once crime became this rallying cry for the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois classes, it provided justification for increasing the brutal tactics and surveillance to isolate the Black poor in these tiny enclaves away from areas of capital accumulation, and to also, and this is critical, to disrupt their geographical and social interaction with private spaces outside of our neighborhoods. Dylan Munford continued his personal crusade to portray Black collective activity as undesirable into his quote that he often gave press conferences of, quote, frankly, I'm terrified at the future of Atlanta. The city won't survive if it is to become all Black, a welfare capital, a crime haven, the crime capital of the South, end quote. So Atlanta's power structure attempted to scare the crime crisis in the residents via the local media, and in August 1973, they sponsored a 90-minute community dialogue called Murder in Atlanta on WSB-TV. Now, any average everyday person that flips on their television set and sees the title of a program called Murder in Atlanta, what are they automatically going to think? That this is legitimately a problem and we need to be terrified at these areas of Black space. And so that was what they did. And they put a bunch of affluent panelists on this thing discussing the problems of crime and where it comes from. And not one of them, except one person, one scholar, said anything about racial oppression as a systemic problem. Mind you now, this is after the Kerner Commission report that deemed that even, it was a liberal document, they even said that racial oppression is a problem in the United States. And yet you have these scholars going on TV and pretty much just saying that there is a pathological problem in Black Atlanta where we are predisposed to crime because of the way we live. And so again, all the pieces are being set up that are planting the seeds for gentrification, for the devaluing of the land and the taking of the space. Now, although elites screamed crime, many of the anti-crime laws the city government passed impeded the Black activists more so because they were the key pieces on the chessboard to get off, to continue oppression. And on March 20th, Atlanta passed a law that resembled the Jim Crow era Mississippi vagrancy black code. City Hall prohibited, quote, loitering, spending time in idleness. That's a word that you don't hear, that you haven't heard since the 1890s. Idleness, lingering, sauntering idly, and lurking, end quote. So that was an actual law passed in 1970, not the 1870s. According to the witnesses in City Hall that day, officials rushed the legislation through the Black Board of Aldermen to be used against the sanitation workers who were currently on strike that day. That was a means to getting the picket lines completely cleansed, where the police went in and arrested dozens of picketers immediately after that law was signed. So again, you can put two and two together to understand how the criminalization of protests, which we are still seeing today, operates in favor of racial oppression. 2 months later, Fulton County Superior Judge Luther Alverson approved a no-knock rule for officers storming residences. So you understand that this didn't originate recently with the situation with the murder of Breonna Taylor, but that no-knocks became a prevalent form of racial oppression passed along by public officials in the 1970s in response to the Black Power movement and organizing. In September that same year, in response to the rebellion sparked by the murder of a 15-year-old Black child named Andre Moore, Atlanta police converted an old library bookmobile into a new mobile police precinct in Summerhill, which is the historical Black area of the city. And for those that are familiar with Atlanta, it is next to what unfortunately now is called Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Vine City. The following year, after 3 Black Edgewood men were beaten by police, African Americans organized multiple protests that culminated in the hearings against the perpetrators. In response, the police aldermanic committee declared that citizen police brutality reports would no longer be made public in Atlanta. Additionally, Atlanta residents were no longer permitted to address the police committee directly concerning any police complaints. So not only are they being resegregated into these apartheid areas, these enclaves of poverty, but when you have a problem with an interaction with police, you have lost the power to tell the city about it. So again, we have to look at it as a power analysis. They systematically removed the power of Black residents to organize themselves against repeated infringes of police on them, not just violence, but surveillance and removal. Jackson spent much of his tenure securing massive funds for police expansion, demonstrating to the power structure that he was the right choice to move the Atlanta metropolitan region towards their interests. Atlanta acquired its most significant funding grant in the mid-1970s when the Nixon administration's Law Enforcement Assistance Administration sent $20 million in crime fighting funds to the city. That's literally what they were earmarked for, is crime fighting. That's a lot of money that Black working class residents and poor people in general have never gotten from a federal government, at least in quite some time. If we're honest, in terms of earmarking directly for the people, and they gave $20 million for crime fighting. And so you know what that meant? That meant that they funded programs that included classification of juvenile probation caseloads. They gave $3.5 million to add 100 more supervisors for adult probations and parolees, and they established multiple new jails and shelters, they called them, for newly released offenders in need of financial and counseling services. The problem is that those financial and counseling services never actually showed up. So these objectives shifted drastically when new Atlanta Police Chief John Inman was appointed to the executive committee that oversaw the planning for that particular federal grant. Now, this is what's crucial about Inman and why I argue that he's one of the most prominent figures in Atlanta history in terms of moving the city towards this pathology against Black working class people for gentrification purposes. Inman's philosophy aligned closely with Jackson's in that he believed police should be a paramilitary occupying force. So when he came in, he actually created the most amount of bureaucratic agencies in the history of the police department. His first innovation, titled Target Hardening Through Opportunity Reduction, Thor. Let me read that again for you all. Target hardening through opportunity reduction. Like, what kind of fascist foolishness is that? And that was the name of one of the most really nasty secret surveillance operatives in the Atlanta Police Department. The program consists of 6 phases intended to what they call check such crimes as breaking and entering, burglary, and larceny of goods from homes and businesses. But this is what's interesting. The largest parts included residential surveys where police officers looked throughout a person's home and demonstrated ways that the owner or renter could make it more difficult to break in. So Thor recruited 50 to 100 business people to give talks and lectures, as well as accompany security officers into residents' homes to not only tell them how people can break in, but to actually take notes about what actually is in the home. So we're not surprised that we had a whole number of no-knock raids happening right after this started, after Thor happened. See how the system all works together. Next, these business folks recruited, when they did the residential surveys and talked to folks, they found what they called, and this is in the document, right-thinking people, and helped and recruited them into an auxiliary police force. So this equated to right-wing vigilantes being used to search people's houses for whatever pretext at this point. The same year, Atlanta police shocked the community by releasing their most recent edition of their newsletter, because all police have newsletters. The one in Atlanta was called Signal 39. On this 4th page, under the headline, quote, it said survival information, end quote. And they call what they have next a red list. Now, this red list detailed the names, aliases, and addresses of all radical and Black nationalist, Black neighborhood leaders and union leaders for the police to target. The statement read as follows, quote, the following list of persons and addresses is furnished by the Intelligence Division in the hopes that it will enable the police officers, the Atlanta Police Department, to stay alive. The following are some of the extremist militant individuals and addresses. Caution should be used when arresting these subjects, or call is received to these addresses. When approaching these addresses and individuals, request assistance and use extreme caution. The residents on the list include Atlanta Black Panther Party leaders Ron Carter and Samuel Lundy, the All African People Party's Willie Ricks, and many other local activists. The addresses were listed for both residents and headquarters, and the red list was sent to all levels of police. What Ron Carter said when asked about this, he stated it was now going to be very difficult to continue their free breakfast program for children at the locations on the red list for fear of violence or harm to the children and neighborhood residents. They revealed that Atlanta police committed an illegal act when they infiltrated the Panthers headquarters in Kirkwood, which is part of the east side of Atlanta, posing as a building inspector. When confronted about this, what the building inspector the police officer posing as building inspector said, quote, well, I just happened to look that building up and it was due for inspection. So I just went along with the building inspection reports, end quote. Towards the end of the confrontation, a family of 3 approached City Hall the week that the red list came out. And they asked why their address was on the list when the only thing they did was host 2 anti-Vietnam War discussion sessions. So by the end, Black Atlantans learned the extent to which Atlanta police had not only infiltrated their organizing meetings and social spaces, but they had set forth in disrupting much needed community service programs that were needed at the time, such as the breakfast and daycare programs. Now, there were some other organizations that Inman helped create, like Stakeout, Decoy, a few others. The Red Dogs come later on. And there's just a lot of details about that. And I'm going to skip through because I know time is running. But because I want us to actually get into exactly what all this does in these areas. So The Atlanta power structure between that mid-1970s period through the 1980s and early 1990s transferred the ever-increasing underground economy of the drug trade, et cetera, from the growing downtown central business district into low-income enclaves throughout the metro region, including Pittsburgh, Summerhill, Fourth Ward, Mechanicsville, East Point, College Park, and Six Flags Drive. Here, the police did not stop nor restrict the flow of the economy. Instead, they allowed it to expand. And here's how they did it. Either through individual payoffs, where there was a federal indictment on police officers in Atlanta in the 1990s that found that they were taking payoffs from drug dealers to allow the flow of underground economy to continue, or to devalue the land and property values. Now, here's where this gets critical. How does police surveillance and everything we just mentioned work in tandem with landlord manipulation to devalorize land and property values for gentrification? Under maintenance and propaganda are key. First, Georgia's repair and deduct statute at the time gave tenants the right to deduct the cost of repairs from their rent payments if landlords did not make or did not rehabilitate within a reasonable period. However, urban landlords preyed on Section 8 residents because urban housing entities like the Atlanta Housing Authority continued to pay the rent for Section 8 residents under a housing assistance payment contract. In other words, landlords accrue profits by foregoing the cost of rehabilitation. And devalorization, which is the devaluing of land, free capital that could be invested in other properties in the city or suburbs. Additionally, under the devalorization plan, if under maintenance progresses throughout the neighborhood, now that's important for later on when I'm about to mention, landlords lose even more incentive to repair dilapidated housing, and the area experiences a net outflow of capital because of, guess what? Reports of public issues of crime in areas. Under maintenance also leads to active disinvestment as capital depreciates and the landlord stakes diminish further. This prompts financial institutions to also disinvest in the area through redlining. And as a result, banks deny loans to Black and brown working class people seeking home ownership in a devalorized area. Why would they do that if the area is poor already? Why not let more Black and brown poor people move into the area? Because the banks are already setting that area up to be bought by white capitalists and rich people to flip the land for profit and to build what they consider to be their future dreams of tourist sites. And of course, if you know the history of Atlanta, World of Coca-Cola, expanding Georgia State University, building Olympic Park, all these tourist areas, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, all these new things that make money for the city, something the residents who are historically Black and working class never did for the city's interests. And that's why it's important to understand the interest element. So next, real estate and police departments encourage local governments to designate the neighborhoods as blighted. Urban municipalities manipulate the political economy of crime to simultaneously expand the underground economy, as I just mentioned, into these areas. So landlords also welcome, and in some cases encouraged by direct payment, vandalism, because it further devalues the property. So after a short period, landlords themselves have disinvested totally from the property, only paying the necessary costs that generate rents until they abandon the property when they can no longer collect enough rent to cover any necessary costs. Typically, landlords abandon properties at the neighborhood-wide scale. That's why when you hear about blighted neighborhoods, or you look and you see reports on television of this dangerous neighborhood, it's always used in those terms because it helps move people out quicker and devalue the land quicker so that any land developer and real estate person can swoop in and declare and purchase this land as being cheap and ours. So the properties are generally structurally sound, mind you, but because they no longer yield any profits for the landlords deem them infeasible. In many cases, they destroy the property. For example, and I'll talk about this more towards the end, landlords abandoned the Techwood and Clark Howell Homes housing projects in Southeast Atlanta and they co-opted their tenants organization, who were the organizers trying to protect their land. They co-opted them when they began protesting this whole thing. See, the black folks knew that they were devaluing the property, and they called them out on it. And so they plucked a few of the tenant leaders out, paid them off to steer the organization in a different direction. So Techwood and Clark Howell homes would now be turned over, and one of those buildings would be destroyed for the Olympics. So how this all worked, by the 1990s, the successes of early gentrification and wounding the social mobility and organizing of Black working classes provided Maynard Jackson, who came back for his third term as mayor, to utilize the Olympics as a justification to enact full-scale neoliberalization throughout the metro region to the detriment of the Black poor. And immediately upon taking his third term, he called out that law and order again in the interest of public safety. So he announced a funding of a transmitter that basically set up this really fascist like security communication network throughout the whole city, where they actually were able to spy on all of the poor Black areas with camcorders, cameras, etc. And again, they were not doing this to stop crime, as I mentioned earlier, or what people consider to be the underground economy. They were doing this because it publicized to the people that this was a devalued land because the types of people that are on it, that we have to put cameras everywhere to watch out for undesirables. So that's the key thing, is the propaganda and the publicity of the space as being undesirable to kill the property values for people to come in and purchase it. And so for the last part of this, I'm going to give you one really good example. And as I mentioned, Techwood Homes earlier, because like I said, there's just so much happening with this that, yeah. So a significant portion of what happens with Techwood and Techwood Homes and Clark Howell were the oldest housing projects in the United States at that time. When City Hall announced the Olympics for Atlanta, all of the entities in the ruling class of Atlanta proposed automatically to remove Techwood Homes tenants, renovate the project, and put the athletes for the Olympics there. Locational advantage was the major reason they did this. The federal government erected the project in 1935 as byproducts of New Deal funding and originally housed whites at first. But after the 1968 Housing Act outlawed segregation in public housing, African Americans moved into the projects. And in fact, between 1970 and 1990, the residency of Black folks in Techwood and Clark Howell jumped from 60 to 90%. When Blacks took the majority in Techwood, the CEO of Coca-Cola, who people put posters on their walls of, Paul Austin said, quote, "The darlings of diversity and philanthropy, the felony rate is about to triple," end quote. That was the CEO of Coca-Cola, Paul Austin. But again, this is a progressive space. The city too busy to hate. So Techwood consisted of so all the details out. In 1991, Jackson formed the Techwood Advisory Committee to negotiate the redevelopment of the projects. The committee consisted of representatives from all the ruling class entities, and they took some of those residents from the Techwood Residents Association. Jackson also appointed the presidents of Georgia Tech University, Georgia State University, Atlanta University, and 3 real estate developers, an investment banking firm, and other consultants on this committee. So take a guess how many times that the residents of the Techwood organization want to vote against all of those capitalists? Never. So you see what they did, just like they do when you talk about doing a police, a community checking of the police. They stack the deck against the residents so they lose any votes on any board. When the committee notified Techwood residents that they plan to develop mixed income housing, which we all know what that means, you'll have about 5% of your housing be for poor people and the 95% be for middle income and rich people. When they told them this, many protested on justified fear of mass displacement. Additionally, the residents accused and sued Techwood Tenants Association President Margie Smith, who sat on the committee planning gentrification, for abusing her power and remaining president past her term ending. Through resident co-optation and questionable ethics in the committee related to a resident survey on redevelopment and a lack of protest resources, Techwood suffered a devastating loss in 1995 when HUD, the Housing, Urban and Development, approved the gentrification plan, which they called the Revised Revitalization Plan, and development pledged that the AHA replace all Techwood housing units that redevelopment eliminated. But here's the issue, though. It must be noted that they forced residents out after the protests happened. You see, when the land got so cheap, and again, this was heavy in terms of the underground economy, a lot of the people who were looking to make money off the Olympics said that we want to stay in Atlanta beyond the Olympics. We want these buildings emptied. And if we're not getting people out by forcing them out rent-wise, then here's what we're going to do. We're going to blatantly break the law. And that's what they did, in that they actually maintained a policy to reduce the project's occupancy rate by 20%. But they utilized an individual that the community supported to manipulate them. Residents occupied 531 of the apartments, which was a 92% occupancy rate in 1990. However, by 1991, the occupancy rate had plummeted to 60% because they literally refused to sign any type of extensions of contracts for people. And remember when I told you about those no-knock raids and letting people to do surveys in the home? Anything that they called to be undesirable or a problematic element, or if your cousin was seen around a group of people who look like they may be selling drugs, you received an eviction notice. That's how they did it. Even though you literally were a college student who could not afford to move anywhere else, and you had a cousin who was walking down the train station and said hello to somebody who knew people that may be in the drug trade, and you got an eviction notice. That's the way they did it. So they stacked the deck against African Americans in the area by utilizing criminalization and the police surveillance of the area as a means to take over the Techwood and Clark Howell projects for the Olympics. And basically, this was the start of the end of public housing in the city, because by 2014, all public housing in Atlanta had been demolished, and there is no public housing in there today. It is gone. And so all the Black working class folks, the majority of them had to live in public housing, had to leave the city, and are now in these rural suburban spaces that are segregated and are surveilled just as bad. And so I just want to, so again, I'm ending here, and I know I skipped over a lot of things because this is such a complex system, but we have to understand as to how the police operate and functioning for capital and the kind of things they do outside of just the things we see on social media and video. They have a much more complicated role in the socio-historical experience of Black people.
Wow, thank you. This is the part where we would applaud. I feel like I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of our attendees did. We're going to move into our Q&A portion. So I want to encourage our attendees to use that Q&A feature and ask your questions there. We actually already have one question from Pat. And she says, during the strike wave period and the attack on union leaders along with Black radicals, what were the relations with the larger labor movement like, including international unions associated with striking locals, any material or vocal support as what was seen in Memphis in 1968?
Sure. Thank you, Pat, for that question. It's actually one of my favorite parts that I wish I could talk more about in terms of this presentation, but because of time, I couldn't get into it. But that was one of the most fascinating things I found, is that you had because the strike wave was predominantly Black, and a lot of the demands of the strikers involved issues of control in relation to racial oppression, many of the unions refused to recognize these strikes. And the most infamous one, this became a national story, was the meat plant strike of 1972 and 73, because it continued. But what ended up happening is you had the October League, who did an amazing job helping the Black workers who, when they went to the union to say that, like they literally had Black workers in the meat plants working in the most dangerous conditions and dying at a high rate, and said this was a racial thing because there were no white workers in any of these areas, that the union said they refused to recognize it and that they wanted to remain non-racial. That was a clear thing that they said often in a lot of these strikes. So you had sanitation workers, you had public city workers, you had dime store workers, and particularly for Black women, this was a major issue with the Black women strikes, and they often led the best and most militant strikes because the white union said that Black women don't, besides the misogyny, they argued that Black women don't make enough money to feed into the per caps that the unions wanted in their dues. So they refused to organize them. So for those restaurant dime store workers, Black women had to organize their own wildcat strikes at the time. And so that was one of the biggest things about Black Power era that nobody talks about, is that you had so many of these labor strikes and labor organizing in Black neighborhoods that were outside of and against the dominant labor movement, because the labor movement absolutely refused to recognize race and racism as a means for striking or as a means of supporting any type of labor militancy. And so that was a major part of it. And the meat strike is something I do a great deal of research on. And it honestly became about control. This idea that we want to control our own lives. We want to have a say in how factories do their work, how we do our work, and the way our neighborhoods can develop from you being in our areas. And so that's why it became what we call proto-nationalists, in the sense that Black people, the Black working class, wanted to have decision-making over how they lived their lives in the 1970s. So it was called proto-nationalism. And that was something that the unions were completely against. And so many of the strikes were wildcat strikes. You're muted.
Knew that would happen at some point. I really appreciate the way you like laid out the complexity. I think oftentimes like public discourse gets, and maybe I won't even use the word public discourse, like social media and like the things I'm seeing, everything gets so reduced and two-dimensional. And so you will see people talking about the link between police brutality and gentrification with no map as you've drawn out as the link between the two. So I'm really grateful for that. We have another question from Nancy. So she says, thank you, Dr. Wood. 2 questions. One, could you explain the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism? 2, the focus on Atlanta, but this focus is on Atlanta, but I assume the same types of actions happen everywhere. How do we address some of these issues?
Sure. The first question is very simple, is that there's very little difference between neoliberalism and neoliberalism, and that neoliberalism is simply an extension of liberalism. And that's what we always must remember. Too often, scholars will like to separate the two and claim that there is just this new insidious manner that neoliberalism is just a complete pivot away from liberalism. It's not true. When you look at the history of liberalism and in terms of the idea that the state and the capital must be protected and capital must move a certain way, that's not different than neoliberalism. The only difference is that there became this idea, and again, I don't want to go over time with this, but it's so critical to understand, is that because the resistance, because of all the movements on the ground across the world for human rights, for civil rights, then for Black power, for brown power, etc., all these rights movement, LGBTQ movements, all the things that were happening, the ruling classes said we need to we cannot continue to fight people resisting and trying to fight oppression. We have to find a way to take away their ability to fight us. What do they use to fight us with? Instead of us fighting them, let's just remove their ability to fight. That's where neoliberalism comes in, is that it's a removal of public resources. And those public resources are sent to the ruling class for privatization. And again, a lot of people like to think, and a lot of top-down people like to argue that this is solely to make profits. It's not true. Profits are a singular understanding of it. The main reason why public spaces are privatized mainly is to take them away from our use for them for social movements and to resist and build movements against oppression in any way. That's the difference between the liberalism of the past and neoliberalism today, is that the taking of public resources so that we can't fight anymore. We don't have the capacity to resist anymore, and giving them to the state or giving them to business owners, real estate, et cetera, to privatize and take away from us. So that's the first example. The next thing that we have to do is we have to continue to do things like this, like what the Y is doing in this awesome series, in terms of how do we solve these issues. We have to start having critical discussions and breaking apart the very, and I thought, Michelle, I love the way you put that, is that there is a reduction and a kind of one-dimensionality in the way we look at police and how they operate, to where, just think about it, we can look at the defunding of police in New Jersey a few years ago and what that did. All they did was redistribute the funds that they were giving to the police, redesignate the police officers, even though they kept the same system. They just redesignated them and sent the money to increase surveillance, which, guess what, led to gentrification in New Jersey. And so, yeah, we have to be honest about when we say we want to defund the police, what does that mean? We have to have a vision for depowering the police state, because there are so many aspects to what they do and how they operate. And so we got to start first. We have to study and start having conversations about what this looks like on the ground. Because if we seek to depower, first and foremost, then you're going to see a loss of power for police officers to shoot and kill Black people and other poor people without anything happening to them. That's how we have to work at this. We can't target specific areas where people are and we're reacting to police shootings, because that's what's been occurring. We have to be proactive and seek out how to depower these spaces. How do we actually move against these state's attorneys, these district attorneys whose job is literally to put people in jail and to increase surveillance and go after police who don't put enough people in jail, who don't arrest enough people. And see, we have to go after these systems of power that allow the police to do what they do on the street. And that's kind of what I'm hoping my study does, is it opens up this type of not just discussion, but we create a framework in moving forward in how to build organizations to address this situation. Because having a discussion is not good enough anymore, since we are in a period of crisis. The discussions have to lead to frameworks. You can't just have a discussion and feel good about it. We have to say, okay, now that we've had the discussion, what are the frameworks we can build off of to actually start going after these systems of power? And that takes us understanding the system first before we can address it directly. And so there's more that we could talk about if there's a second part to this. You know, I'm sorry for taking them so much time, but yeah, it's a very complicated question, but one that we have to address if we're going to move forward and get better.
Well, I would love to have a part two. I would love to hear what else you have to say about moving forward and building frameworks. Because I also had other questions about like police infiltrators and like, but we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much. I feel enlightened. I feel empowered. I am super grateful for your time. I'm super grateful for all of our attendees and your thoughtful questions. Do you have anything any closing thoughts or words you'd like to share?
Sure. And again, there's a lot of anxiety and issues surrounding where we are currently today. And I used the term new nadir. It's not a hyperbole that we are at the lowest point that we've been in terms of race relations, in relation to the political economy. Everything now has been completely racialized, and it is seeming like we are on a hotbed of anger and violence. But again, we have to understand that there are so many aspects of what happens in this political economy that we can use to organize if we take it seriously enough, that we can change things. We can't go into this pessimism, and which is now a big thing, is Afro-pessimism and all that stuff. We can't go into those ideas. We have to continue to believe that there's a dialectic to how racial oppression operates, that we have always resisted and they have always responded to our resistance. Remember, we drive how they determine things. They don't come up with this stuff themselves. They're afraid of how we organize and upset at us coming together collectively. So that's what we have to always continue to do in creating this framework, is do it collectively. So I thank you for the Y for doing this incredibly important series. And we have to continue to support alternative measures like what the Y is doing if we're going to keep growing.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wood. And yeah, as someone mentioned in the chat, really looking forward to your book and really looking forward to learning more. So thank you and have a good weekend, everybody.